Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. Thank you very much for joining me today. My name is Mies Nass. I'm from not too far away. I'm from Glenview, Illinois. I'm sure many of you recognize me as a rather familiar face from performing for many background music events over by the fireplace over there last summer, fall, and earlier this year. But if you recall, last November, around Thanksgiving, I performed a solo recital here at Sedgebrook consisting of a lot of classical repertoire, Chopin's Second Sonata, and some music by Dave Brubeck. But today, if you look at the program, I bring to you what I call like a hybrid program between classical and jazz. So the title of it is An Afternoon of Brahms, Ballads, and Blues, and I threw in a little hard bop music in there as well. But a little bit about myself. I'm currently a junior up at Lake Forest College in Lake Forest, Illinois, where I'm currently majoring in music, specifically, of course, classical and jazz piano, who would have thought. And I currently study with Professor Chris White up at Lake Forest College, and I also study cinema studies, so essentially learning how to write music for the screen, composing film scores, soundtracks, and really analyzing how present-day composers and film scores from many, many years ago, how they created their artwork. I also studied through New Music School in Chicago, Illinois, with the former Chicago Symphony Orchestra emeritus pianist Mary Sauer, and I also studied with classical pianist Jeff Ponko as well. Up at Lake Forest, I study with Chris White for my jazz and composition studies, and then I also work with two jazz combos, one at Lake Forest College, where we study a lot of jazz fusion, the Herbie Hancock music, of course, instrumental tunes, and I also work with another jazz combo based out of, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we work with a couple of vocalists up there, so of course we'll play Misty and the Days of Wine and Roses once in a while. But on today's program, I'll be opening it with some music by classical composer Johannes Brahms. Brahms was a Romantic era composer, and of course you know the lullaby, that's the guy that I'm talking about. But in today's program, I bring to you some music, specifically the Opus 117 Intermezzi. And now there's three pieces in this collection of music. The first one, it's very tranquil, it's very calm, it's like a lullaby. Please don't fall asleep, it's a very beautiful piece, I can assure you that. And the second intermezzo is of complete contrast. It's very effervescent, and in a way, I think Brahms is like confessing love either for his contemporary composer, Clara Schumann, who is married to Robert Schumann, or his love for the instrument and piano music in general. But in that too, you hear how Brahms is creating so many different musical narratives in that piece, and there's so many different images that he's using, and in a way I'd like to think he's implementing elements of nature into the music, but not really. And then the last intermezzo, it's very dark, it's very gloomy. I think it defines the Chicago overcast day perfectly, perhaps a day like today, even though it's a little bit warmer outside, thankfully. And then going into the Rhapsody, which is of complete contrast, it's completely different. This piece was written when Brahms, a lot of music pedagogues and historians consider this piece to be at the peak of his career. And what do I mean by that? Well, the opening of it is very bold, it's very dramatic, and yes, that's Brahms' character, his musical signature in the music. But the different themes in it evoke a lot of different emotions, and it becomes very tranquil, it becomes very melancholic in a certain way. And then Brahms, of course, has to end it in a very dramatic way because that's just the way he is. Then going into the second half of today's program, I'll be opening it with two ballads, which two you probably have heard at one point or another. Myself, I like to listen to the Frank Sinatra rendition, which is The Days of Wine and Roses. And Henry Mancini is a really well-known film composer. Of course, he did the Pink Panther theme. I'm a huge fan of that myself. But Henry Mancini, of course, wrote the music for the play Days of Wine and Roses, which I believe this year is the 100th anniversary, and they were going on tour with the play, the theater play of it. And then I'll also be playing Misty by Errol Garner. I really like to study Errol Garner's career and his musicianship from a general perspective because when he was a really young musician just starting out, he never really learned how to read sheet music. He always learned how to play by ear, and there are many musicians out there today that's how they learn music and how they started their careers. But Errol Garner, when he was residing in New York City, he went to a concert from classical pianist Emil Gilels, and Gilels probably performed a lot of Beethoven's Scriabin and Rachmaninoff because that's just who Gilels was on his programs. But Garner went back to his apartment in New York City, and he was able to play the entire program on the piano by ear, by memory, with no sheet music, and it's pretty amazing, right? But going into the next tune, which is Daahoud, which also means David in English. This tune was written by famous musician, jazz musician, Clifford Brown. And this was featured on an album with Clifford Brown and drummer Max Roach. Both of them recorded this tune. They threw it on an album. They put These Foolish Things on there and a couple other great tunes by Duke Jordan. But in Clifford Brown's music, you'll notice how it's a different style than like bebop. This is hard bop music, which is post Charlie Parker. And Charlie Parker's music is very fast on the trumpet and it's crazy music. But this is different. There's a lot more breathability within the music. And the last two tunes to close out today's program will be by Bobby Timmons, and those are Dat Dere and Moanin. Now, like with Days of Wine and Roses, Misty, Dat Dere also has lyrics, which I will not be singing, and that's probably a good thing. But Bobby Timmons was part of a jazz collection called Soul Jazz Music. And in a way, I like to think that he invented a new style of music. Bobby Timmons went to work with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, and they toured throughout Western Europe and of course here in the United States. And then Bobby Timmons also went to work with the Nat Adderley Quintet, here in the United States, and played a lot of great tunes with them and many albums he worked with them on. So without further ado, I'm now going to start Brahms, the Intermezzi, the completed collection, Opus 117. Thank you very much for joining me today. was a little bit loud, I know. It was a very dramatic piece. But the music of Brahms, that's his character in a way, and transitioning from late Brahms, like the Intermezzi, the first collection of music that you heard, to the Rhapsody just now, it's quite impressive how different of a musician Brahms evolved over the course of his career. But now, let's change the vibe in the room a little bit. I'm going to play two tunes, The Days of Wine and Roses by Henry Mancini and Misty by Errol Garner. If you recall before, I was talking a lot about how Errol Garner was regarded for really being able to play anything. He could hear it from a mile away, and he'll go to the piano and he'll be able to play it. But Errol Garner went to a concert over in New York City when, I forgot how old he was, but I think he was around my age or a little bit older. And he went to see a classical concert of Emile Gilels perform Beethoven, I believe it was. And Errol Garner went back to his apartment that very night when he was residing in New York City, of course, and he was able to recite and but play that program on the piano. No sheet music, nothing, just remembering how the concert sounded. So I guess Emile Gilels, his playing really sits in with some people. But I'm now going to perform those two ballads, The Days of Wine and Roses and Misty. transitioning from ballads, hard bop music of Clifford Brown, what you just heard. I'm going to close off today's program with two tunes by soul jazz pianist Bobby Timmons. So now what you just heard was music of the hard bop era by Clifford Brown, and that last tune that I just played, Daahoud, was featured on an album with Clifford Brown and drummer Max Roach. Two of them worked a lot together, very fine musicians, probably one of my favorite jazz albums of all time. But talking about Bobby Timmons, he worked a lot with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. So Art Blakey was a pianist, but funny story is Errol Garner ended up taking his piano position. I believe it was at a bar or someplace here in the United States, and so the owner said, "Blakey, you're on drums now," and he was forced to learn drums. But many years later, Bobby Timmons had the fortunate opportunity to work with Art Blakey, and he also worked with Nat Adderley, or the Cannonball Adderley Quintet, and they went on tour. They released a lot of albums, and for example, Cannonball Adderley's most well-known tune is Work Song, and it's like another blues tune. But in terms of the two tunes that I'll perform for you today, both of them Bobby Timmons wrote. And with Dat Dere, it's a very soulful tune. It's a little bit of a quicker one, but with Moanin, Bobby Timmons, during their rehearsals and their recording sessions, he would always play this motive that you'll hear in the beginning of Moanin, and you'll be able to identify it pretty quickly because it'll probably be stuck in your head for the next 3.5 days after you hear it. But with Moanin, he would always play that motive, and then his colleague, I believe it was Benny Golson, said to him, "Bobby, why don't you put a bridge to that?" So he puts a bridge to it, and then fast forward many years later to this very day, it's one of the most sold and highly regarded jazz albums of all time, with, of course, featuring Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. Now, Bobby Timmons also formed his own piano trio where they had drums and a bass player, and he also recorded both of these tunes on one of his albums with that. So I want to thank you all for joining me today, and I'm going to close out this afternoon's program with Moanin and Dat Dere by Bobby Timmons. I just want to thank all of you for joining me today this afternoon. It was a great pleasure to be back here at Sedgebrook and perform an afternoon of Brahms Ballads and Blues. I'll be back sometime in the future. In the meantime, be well.
Thank you.